The cameras were rolling. Every major news network in America had descended upon St. Patrick's Cathedral in downtown Chicago like vultures circling fresh carrion. Inside the Gothic walls, 2,000 of the most powerful people in the country sat in silence, their heads bowed not in prayer but in calculation. Richard Donovan was dead, and with him a $2 billion empire hung in the balance. The mahogany casket gleamed under the cathedral's ancient lights, draped in an American flag that seemed almost too small to contain the legend of the man beneath it. Senators whispered to oil executives. Tech moguls checked their phones for stock updates. The widow, Margaret Donovan, sat in the front row wearing black Chanel and a mask of perfect composure that had taken her 40 years to master. CNN's cameras swept across the crowd, capturing the aristocracy of American capitalism in their natural habitat, a room where grief was measured in market shares and tears were as rare as honest tax returns. The anchor's voice carried through the cathedral's speakers with rehearsed solemnity. Today, Chicago mourns the loss of Richard Donovan, the self-made billionaire who transformed a small investment firm into one of America's most powerful financial empires. From humble beginnings in Detroit to the Forbes billionaire list, Donovan's story, the cathedral doors creaked open. Every head turned. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The lawyers sitting behind her exchanged glances that could have cut glass. A young man stepped through the doorway, his movements deliberate but uncertain. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with sandy brown hair and features that seemed somehow familiar to those who looked closely enough. His clothes were simple, a modest grey suit that had clearly been purchased for this occasion, the creases still sharp from the store packaging. But it wasn't his appearance that sent whispers rippling through the congregation like wildfire. It was the yellow envelope clutched in his trembling hands, and the unmistakable characteristics that marked him as different, the distinctive facial features, the careful way he navigated the aisle, the innocent determination in his eyes that seemed to pierce through 30 years of carefully constructed lies. Security guards positioned near the altar shifted uncomfortably. Margaret Donovan's face had gone ashen beneath her makeup. The priests looked bewildered, their program containing no mention of additional speakers. The young man walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls like gunshots. Each step brought him closer to the microphone, closer to the casket, closer to the moment that would shatter the greatest lie in Chicago's business history. "Ma'am," one of the security guards whispered urgently into his radio, "we have a situation." But Thomas Donovan, for that was indeed his name, though the world didn't know it yet, was already at the podium. The yellow envelope in his hands contained 30 years of secrets, handwritten letters, hidden photographs, and the evidence of a love so profound and so shameful that it had shaped the destiny of one of America's most powerful men. The cameras focused on his face as he adjusted the microphone with shaking fingers. Margaret half rose from her seat, her lawyer grabbing her arm to pull her back down. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Thomas looked out at the sea of faces, faces that had never seen him before, faces that belonged to a world that had been carefully hidden from him. His eyes found the casket, and for a moment, his composure nearly broke. Then he opened the envelope. "My name is Thomas Donovan," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's sound system. "And Richard Donovan was my father." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. But that wasn't the beginning of the story. To understand how this moment came to pass, how a secret could be buried so deep that it took a funeral to unearth it, we must go back. Back to when Richard Donovan was just another ambitious young man, with everything to prove and everything to lose. Back to when fear was stronger than love and shame more powerful than truth. 33 years earlier. The snow fell heavy on Detroit's empty streets, the night Richard Donovan learned he was going to be a father. It was December 1991, and the city was still bleeding from the auto industry's wounds, its factories standing like monuments to better times. Richard sat in his battered Honda Civic outside the clinic, watching snowflakes melt against the windshield, while Sarah clutched the positive pregnancy test in her hands. "We're not ready for this," she whispered, her breath fogging the passenger window. At 23, she was a kindergarten teacher with dreams of saving the world one child at a time. Richard, 25, was 3 years into building an investment firm that existed mainly in his imagination and a cramped office above a deli. "We'll figure it out," Richard said, though his voice carried doubt. He thought of his father, Colonel William Donovan, whose military precision had shaped every moment of Richard's childhood. Weakness was not tolerated in the Donovan household. Neither was failure. A man provides, Richard. Everything else is excuses. The Colonel's voice echoed in his memory as Richard drove through the snowy streets toward the small apartment he shared with Sarah. They'd been together for 2 years, and while he loved her gentle spirit and endless optimism, he also knew she represented everything his father would consider soft, unambitious, common. But Richard was determined to prove the Colonel wrong. He would build something magnificent. He would provide not just for his family but for himself, the recognition, the respect, the power that came with true success in America. The pregnancy proceeded normally until the 7th month, when routine tests revealed something that changed everything. Their son would be born with Down syndrome. Richard remembered the genetic counselor's careful words, the pamphlets filled with smiling families, the gentle suggestions about options and quality of life. But what he remembered most clearly was the phone call to his father. Christ, Richard, this is what happens when you settle for less than the best. The Colonel's disgust was palpable, even through the long-distance connection from his retirement home in Arizona. There was no congratulations, no comfort, no grandfatherly warmth, only disappointment and the implicit message that Richard had somehow failed before his son had even drawn breath. "He's still going to be our child," Richard had said, surprised by his own defiance. "Your choice, son. But understand, in my world, we didn't have the luxury of keeping broken things. You might want to consider what kind of life you're really offering." The call ended with the Colonel's customary abruptness, leaving Richard alone with fears he couldn't name and expectations he couldn't escape. Thomas William Donovan was born on April 15, 1992, during a thunderstorm that knocked out power to half of Detroit. In the dim emergency lighting of the delivery room, Richard held his son for the first time and felt something crack open in his chest. Not the hardened shell his father had built, but something deeper and more vulnerable. The baby's eyes, when they finally opened, were the same deep blue as Richard's own. His tiny fingers gripped Richard's thumb with surprising strength, and for one perfect moment, nothing else existed except the miracle of his son's breathing. "He's beautiful," Sarah whispered from the hospital bed, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. And he was. Thomas was absolutely beautiful. For the first 6 months, they tried to make it work. Richard threw himself into his business with desperate energy, working 18-hour days to build the capital base that would eventually become Donovan Investments. Sarah adapted to motherhood with the same grace she brought to everything, learning Thomas's needs and celebrating each small milestone as if it were a victory against impossible odds. But the outside world was different. The stares in grocery stores, the subtle questions from potential clients who visited their home, the way conversations stopped when Richard carried Thomas into the office. Most damaging of all were the visits from the Colonel, who came to Detroit exactly twice to meet his grandson. Both times he treated Thomas like a stranger, polite but distant, speaking to him in the careful tone reserved for foreign dignitaries or dangerous animals. "You're building something important, Richard. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment about what's best for everyone." The Colonel's words planted seeds of doubt that grew in the fertile ground of Richard's ambition. By Thomas's first birthday, those seeds had blossomed into a plan that would haunt Richard for the rest of his life. Sarah's sister Linda lived in the small town of Millbrook, Wisconsin, population 3,847. She was unmarried, childless, and completely devoted to Thomas during her visits. When Richard suggested that perhaps Thomas would have more opportunities in a smaller community, Linda didn't question his logic. When he offered to provide generous financial support for Thomas's care and education, she agreed to become his guardian. "It's temporary," Richard told Sarah as they packed Thomas's belongings into boxes that seemed impossibly small for a life being uprooted. "Just until the business gets established, until we can provide him with everything he deserves." Sarah wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. And so she helped load their 14-month-old son into Linda's station wagon and watched them drive away through tears she told herself were temporary too. The official story was simple. Thomas was Linda's adopted son, a distant relative who needed a stable home. Richard's business associates never questioned the narrative. And why would they? Richard Donovan was clearly focused on building his empire, unencumbered by the complications that held other men back. Within 5 years, Donovan Investments had offices in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis. Within 10 years, Richard had earned his first $100 million and married Margaret Whitfield, the daughter of a federal judge and the kind of woman who looked perfect in Forbes photo spreads. The colonel lived just long enough to see Richard featured on the cover of Fortune magazine in 2003, the article calling him the new Wolf of Wall Street but with a conscience. In his final letter, written from the hospice where he spent his last days, the colonel's approval was grudging but real. "You made the hard choices, son. That's what separates leaders from followers." Richard kept the letter in his desk drawer for 19 years, rereading it whenever the weight of his choices became unbearable. And as his empire grew, from hundreds of millions to billions, from Chicago to New York to international markets, Thomas remained in Millbrook, living a quiet life that Richard visited in secret, carrying love and guilt in equal measure. But secrets, like empires, have a way of demanding their due. Margaret Donovan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Lincoln Park mansion, watching Chicago's skyline glitter in the distance like scattered diamonds. It was September 2018, and Richard's empire had never been stronger. Donovan Investments managed over $50 billion in assets, with offices from Manhattan to Hong Kong. The Tribune had just named him Chicago's most influential businessman for the third consecutive year, yet something was wrong with her husband. Richard sat at his mahogany desk across the room, supposedly reviewing quarterly reports, but Margaret had learned to read the signs. His fingers drummed against the leather desktop in the specific rhythm that meant his mind was elsewhere. His phone had buzzed 17 times in the past hour. She'd been counting, and he'd ignored every call. "The foundation dinner is tomorrow," Margaret said without turning from the window. "The photographer from Vanity Fair will be there." Richard murmured, not looking up from papers he wasn't really reading. The Richard Donovan Foundation was Margaret's creation, a charitable organization focused on providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children. It was perfect for their public image, photogenic, uncontroversial, and thoroughly in line with Richard's carefully crafted persona as a businessman with a heart. What Margaret didn't know was that every dollar the foundation raised felt like another weight on Richard's conscience. How could he champion opportunities for children while his own son remained hidden in Wisconsin, dependent on Richard's guilt money and Linda's kindness? "Richard?" Margaret's voice carried a sharp edge. "Are you listening to me?" "Of course." Richard finally looked up, his practiced smile sliding into place. "The foundation dinner, Vanity Fair. I'll be there." But his phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't hide the way his jaw tightened. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Who keeps calling you?" "Business, always business." It wasn't entirely a lie. Linda had been calling all day with updates about Thomas. At 26, he'd been diagnosed with early-stage diabetes, a common complication for adults with Down syndrome. The condition was manageable, but it required careful monitoring and lifestyle changes that worried Linda. "He's asking for you," Linda had said in her last voicemail. "He knows something's wrong, Richard. He's not a child anymore. He understands more than we give him credit for." Richard had been visiting Thomas every few weeks for 26 years, always in secret, always with the same cover story about business trips to Milwaukee. He'd watched his son grow from a toddler into a remarkable young man, funny, kind, and possessed of an emotional intelligence that often left Richard feeling like the child in their relationship. But the visits were becoming more complicated. Thomas asked questions about why his father never stayed long, why they couldn't spend holidays together, why Richard seemed sad even during their happiest moments together, and Richard's answers, vague mentions of work responsibilities and complicated family situations, were starting to ring hollow even to himself. "I need to go to Milwaukee next week," Richard announced, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. Margaret turned from the window, her expression unreadable. "Another emergency acquisition?" "Something like that." She studied his face with the calculating gaze that had made her one of Chicago's most successful corporate lawyers before she'd chosen to manage Richard's public image instead. 22 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the difference between Richard's business stress and whatever this was. "You've been taking a lot of trips to Milwaukee lately. It's a growing market. For a man who once told me Milwaukee was where ambition goes to die." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Crawford, Richard's head of communications, who burst through the study doors with the barely contained panic of a man whose job depended on controlling narratives that refused to stay controlled. "We have a situation," James announced, clutching his tablet like a lifeline. "The Tribune is running a story tomorrow about the foundation. They're calling it an investigative piece." Margaret's posture straightened. "Investigative how?" "They're questioning the effectiveness of our programs, looking into how funds are allocated. They'd been talking to former employees, digging through financial records. Richard felt the familiar flutter of panic in his chest. Any deep investigation into his finances ran the risk of uncovering the payments to Linda, payments that would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give. How bad? He asked. Could be worse. They're not alleging fraud, just inefficiency, poor oversight, the usual non-profit criticism. James scrolled through his notes. But they want a response, a comprehensive one, and they're pushing for a face-to-face interview. Margaret moved to stand behind Richard's chair, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that appeared supportive but felt like a claim of ownership. We'll handle it. Richard's always been transparent about the Foundation's operations, but Richard was thinking about Thomas, about the questions that would inevitably arise if investigators started following money trails, about Linda, who had protected his secret for decades but might not understand the need to continue lying if pressed by professional journalists. His phone buzzed again. This time, he looked at the screen. Linda, for the 19th time that day. "I need to take this," he said, standing abruptly. "It's urgent." He walked out onto the terrace, leaving Margaret and James to exchange meaningful glances behind him. The Chicago wind cut through his shirt as he answered the call. "Linda, what's wrong?" "Richard, you need to come here now." Linda's voice was tight with anxiety. "Thomas collapsed at work today. He's in the hospital." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What do you mean, collapsed?" His blood sugar spiked dangerously high. "The doctors say it's under control now, but—" Linda's voice broke. "He's scared, Richard. He keeps asking why his father isn't here, and I don't know what to tell him anymore." Through the glass doors, Richard could see Margaret and James deep in conversation, their faces grave as they planned damage control for problems they couldn't imagine. His empire, built on 30 years of careful image management and strategic deception, suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," Richard said quietly. "What about your wife, your business?" Richard looked back at Margaret, who was watching him through the glass with undisguised suspicion. "I'll figure something out." But as he ended the call, Richard realized that the time for figuring things out was running short. Thomas wasn't a secret that could be managed indefinitely. He was a man who deserved a father's presence in moments of crisis, regardless of the cost to Richard's carefully constructed life. The Tribune investigation was just the beginning. Richard could feel the walls of his deception starting to crack, and he wasn't sure his empire was strong enough to survive the truth. Inside, Margaret was waiting. "Milwaukee again?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual. "Yes, there's been a development." "In the middle of a PR crisis?" Richard met her gaze, and for a moment, he considered telling her everything, about Thomas, about Linda, about the decades of lies that had shaped their marriage and his career, about the son who called him Dad in private and meant it more than Richard had ever meant anything in his public life. Instead, he said, "Some things can't wait." Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "No, Richard, I suppose they can't." And in that moment, Richard Donovan, master of the universe, builder of empires, keeper of secrets, realized that his greatest crisis wasn't coming from the Tribune or his competitors or the markets he'd conquered. It was coming from the truth he'd been running from for 30 years. A truth that was no longer content to stay hidden. The Millbrook General Hospital's ICU smelled of disinfectant and quiet desperation. Richard sat beside Thomas's bed at 2:47, holding his son's hand while machines beeped their electronic lullabies. Thomas was stable now, but the scare had aged both of them in ways that had nothing to do with time. "Dad?" Thomas's voice was hoarse but insistent. "Why don't you live with us?" It was the question Richard had been dreading for years, asked now with the clarity that sometimes comes from facing mortality, even briefly. Thomas's cognitive delays had never affected his emotional intelligence, and at 26, he understood far more about love and abandonment than Richard had ever given him credit for. "It's complicated, son. Because you're important." The word hit Richard like a physical blow. Important, yes, he was important to shareholders and senators and CEOs around the world. But to the person who mattered most, he was an absence. A father who appeared like a ghost, showered him with gifts and attention for a few hours, then vanished back to a life Thomas wasn't allowed to share. "Because I'm a coward," Richard said quietly, the truth slipping out in the pre-dawn vulnerability of a hospital room. Thomas squeezed his father's hand. "You're not a coward. Cowards don't come when their kids are sick." But Richard knew better. A brave man would have faced the world with his son beside him. A brave man wouldn't have built an empire on the foundation of his child's exile. Linda appeared in the doorway, carrying coffee, and wearing the expression of a woman who'd spent 30 years watching someone she loved make increasingly destructive choices. "The reporters are back," she said quietly. Richard's blood ran cold. "What reporters?" "Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, and some woman from CNN. They showed up at my house this morning asking questions about payments from Chicago and my relationship with Richard Donovan." The hospital room suddenly felt airless. Richard stood, his mind racing through the implications. If investigators had tracked his payments to Linda, how long before they connected her to Thomas? How long before Thomas became a footnote in his father's public destruction? "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. But they're not going away, Richard. And they're not stupid." Linda's voice carried 30 years of accumulated frustration. "Maybe it's time to stop running." "I'm not running. You've been running since the day you put him in my car." Linda's whisper was fierce with protective anger. "And I've been helping you run because I thought it was best for Thomas. But look at him, Richard. Really look at him." Thomas was watching their conversation with the focused attention of someone who understood that his life was being discussed in coded language. His face showed confusion, hurt, and something else, a growing awareness that the adults in his life had been lying to him about something fundamental. "Dad?" Thomas's voice was small. "Are you in trouble?" Richard sat back down, taking his son's hand again. "How do you explain to someone you love that their very existence has been treated as a shameful secret? How do you justify 30 years of choosing reputation over relationship?" His phone rang. "Margaret." "I have to take this," Richard said, though every instinct screamed at him to stay. He stepped into the hallway, acutely aware that Linda was watching him with disappointment that felt heavier than his father's disapproval had ever been. "Where are you?" Margaret's voice was crisp with barely controlled anger. "Milwaukee, I told you." "Cut the shit, Richard. I've had 3 reporters call our house this morning asking about secret payments and hidden family members. James is having a nervous breakdown and I just got off the phone with our lawyer." The fluorescent lights above Richard's head hummed with electrical judgment. Other hospital visitors moved past him, real families dealing with real crises without the complications of lies and public personas. "Margaret, 30 years." Her voice broke slightly. 30 years of marriage, and you've been sending money to some woman in Wisconsin? The Tribune has bank records, Richard. They have phone logs. They have evidence of a relationship you've been lying about for our entire marriage. It's not what you think. Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been supporting another woman and possibly another family while building your reputation as Chicago's most devoted husband. Through the ICU window, Richard could see Thomas trying to sit up in bed, probably looking for his father. Linda was helping him, her movements gentle and practiced, the actions of someone who'd been the primary caregiver for a child who wasn't even hers. "I have a son," Richard said quietly. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Richard wondered if the call had dropped. "What did you say?" "I have a son, Thomas. He's 26 years old, and he has Down syndrome. He lives with Linda because I was too much of a coward to bring him into our world." The sound that came from Margaret's end of the phone wasn't quite a gasp, wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of a life being rewritten in real time, of assumptions crumbling like houses built on sand. "You have a son?" "Yes." "For 26 years?" "Yes." "And you never told me?" "No." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Jesus Christ, Richard. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to us? To your business? To everything we've built?" "Everything we've built." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Richard thought of Thomas lying in a hospital bed, wondering why his father had stepped away to take a phone call instead of staying beside him. He thought of Linda, who'd given up any chance of her own family to raise his son. He thought of 30 years of birthday parties he'd missed, school plays he'd avoided, Christmas mornings he'd spent in Lincoln Park, while his son woke up in Millbrook. "Maybe it's time for everything to come down," Richard said. This time the silence was absolute. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was cold as lake ice in January. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare destroy everything because you're having some midlife crisis of conscience. We can manage this. We can spin this. But not if you decide to play the noble truth-teller now. He's my son, Margaret. He's been your son for 26 years without destroying us. Figure out how to keep it that way." The line went dead. Richard stood in the hospital hallway, surrounded by the quiet chaos of real human crisis, and realized that the life he'd spent decades building was about to collapse. Not because of market forces or business competition or the Tribune's investigation, but because love and shame were incompatible forces, and he'd been trying to balance them for far too long. When he returned to Thomas's room, his son was sitting up, more alert than he'd been since the collapse. "Dad, are you okay? You look sad." Richard sat down heavily in the bedside chair, feeling every one of his 57 years. Linda had stepped out, leaving them alone with the truth that had been too large to speak for 3 decades. "Thomas," Richard began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there are some things I need to tell you about our family, about why I can't always be here the way I want to be." But before he could continue, Linda burst back into the room, her face flushed with panic. "Richard, we need to go now. The reporters found the hospital. They're in the lobby asking questions about Thomas Donovan." Through the window, Richard could see news vans pulling into the parking lot. CNN, Fox, Tribune, Sun-Times. The circus had come to Millbrook, and the secret that had shaped 30 years of his life was about to become national news. Thomas looked from Richard to Linda, finally understanding that whatever was happening was bigger than a business crisis. "Dad, who are those people?" Richard took his son's face in his hands, memorizing the features that had haunted his dreams and his conscience for decades. "Those people are about to learn who you are, and I'm going to tell them myself." Because Richard Donovan, for the first time in 30 years, was done running. The media frenzy that erupted outside Millbrook General Hospital made national news within hours. By noon, Richard Donovan's secret had become America's obsession. CNN led with Billionaire's hidden son, while Fox News ran the shame of success. The Tribune, having broken the story, watched with satisfaction as their investigation became the week's defining narrative. But Richard wasn't ready for the world's judgment. Not yet. He'd managed to get Thomas discharged and back to Linda's house through a service exit, avoiding the cameras that turned the hospital parking lot into a media carnival. Now he sat in Linda's modest kitchen, watching his son eat oatmeal and seemingly unbothered by the chaos his existence had caused. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," Linda said, gesturing toward the unplugged landline on her counter. "Network producers, book agents, documentary filmmakers. Everyone wants to tell Thomas's story." "Our story," Richard corrected quietly. "Is it? Because for 30 years, you've acted like Thomas was my story, my responsibility, my life to manage while you played corporate emperor." The words stung because they were true. Richard had built his empire by compartmentalizing his life so completely that he'd convinced himself the payments to Linda were charity rather than child support, that his secret visits were kindness rather than the bare minimum of fatherhood. Thomas looked up from his breakfast. "Dad, why are all those people here?" It was the question Richard had been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. "How do you explain to your adult son that his existence has been treated as a corporate liability? How do you justify decades of cowardice?" "Thomas," Richard began carefully, "you know how I come visit you, but I don't live here." "Yeah, because your work is far away. That's part of it, but there's more." Richard pulled out his phone, showing Thomas the news coverage. "These people found out about you, about us, and they want to know why I've kept you a secret." Thomas studied the phone screen with the concentration he brought to everything important. Richard watched his son's face, searching for signs of hurt or anger or the disappointment he surely deserved. Instead, Thomas smiled. "You were protecting me," he said with the simple clarity that had always been his gift. "What? Like Superman protects Lois Lane. You kept me safe from the bad guys." Richard felt his throat close. Even now, facing the collapse of everything he'd built, Thomas's first instinct was to find the heroic interpretation of his father's choices. It was a generosity of spirit that Richard had never earned and certainly didn't deserve. Linda, however, was less forgiving. "He wasn't protecting you, sweetie," she said gently but firmly. "He was protecting himself." The truth hung in the kitchen air like smoke. Thomas looked from Linda to Richard, processing this new information with the methodical way he approached complex problems. "Dad, is that true?" Richard wanted to lie. God, how he wanted to construct another comfortable fiction that would preserve his son's faith in him. But the time for lies had passed. The world already knew the facts. What remained was Thomas's right to understand them. "Yes," Richard said, "that's true. I was scared of what people would think. Scared it would hurt my business. Scared I wasn't strong enough to handle their judgment. But I'm not scary," Thomas said, confused. "No, son, you're perfect. I was the problem." They were interrupted by the sound of cars pulling into Linda's driveway. Through the kitchen window, Richard could see black SUVs with government plates. the kind used by federal agencies when they wanted to project authority without drawing attention. Linda peeked through the curtains. FBI. Richard's phone rang. James Crawford, his communications director. Richard, where the hell are you? The SEC just raided our Chicago office. They're looking for financial records related to undisclosed family obligations. Margaret's lawyer is having a coronary, and our stock price is down 18%. The dominoes were falling faster than Richard had anticipated. Her story about a hidden son had morphed into questions about financial impropriety, which had triggered regulatory investigations that could destroy his company, regardless of the truth. James, and that's not the worst part. Margaret's called a board meeting for tomorrow morning. She's pushing for your immediate resignation as CEO. Richard closed his eyes. In the space of 24 hours, he was losing everything. His marriage, his company, his carefully constructed public image. Everything except the one thing that had always mattered most, and that he'd been too blind to see. Dad? Thomas was watching him with concern. Are you in big trouble? The FBI agents were walking up the front path now, their purpose clear even without warrants visible. Richard realized he had perhaps minutes before this kitchen, the one place where he could still be just Thomas's father, became another crime scene in the media narrative. Thomas, Richard said urgently, I need you to understand something. No matter what happens next, no matter what people say about me, you are the best thing I've ever done. Not my business, not my money, not anything else. You. Thomas smiled, the radiant smile that had been lighting Richard's secret world for 26 years. I love you too, Dad. The doorbell rang. Linda squeezed Richard's shoulder. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. All of us. But Richard knew better. He'd spent 30 years trying to live in two worlds, and the collision had finally come. Now he had to choose. The empire built on his son's exile, or the relationship he'd been too cowardly to claim. Looking at Thomas, the choice was simpler than he'd ever imagined it could be. Gentlemen, Richard called toward the front door, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded boardrooms for decades. I'm Richard Donovan, and I'll be right with you. He turned back to Thomas. Son, would you like to come to Chicago with me? It's time people met my boy. Thomas's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? I can see where you live? If you want to, but I should warn you, it's going to be complicated. There are going to be cameras and questions and people who might not be very nice. Thomas considered this seriously, then shrugged with the wisdom of someone who'd faced harder challenges than public scrutiny. That's okay, Dad. I'm good at complicated. And Richard Donovan, who'd spent 3 decades running from the most uncomplicated love of his life, finally understood what courage actually looked like. The Richard Donovan who walked into the Chicago FBI field office on Michigan Avenue was not the same man who'd built a financial empire on the foundation of his son's exile. Thomas walked beside him, holding his father's hand with the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never doubted he belonged wherever his dad was going. The media storm outside was unprecedented. CNN had gone to continuous coverage, Fox News was running special segments, and every major newspaper in America was scrambling to understand how one of the country's most successful businessmen had hidden a son for 3 decades. The questions weren't just about family anymore. They were about character, about the moral foundation of American capitalism, about what it meant to be a leader when your leadership was built on lies. Inside the federal building, Special Agent Patricia Morse sat across from Richard with the patient demeanor of someone who'd been investigating white-collar crime long enough to recognize the difference between criminal behavior and moral failure. Mr. Donovan, she began, let's be clear about why we're here. The payments to Linda Hartwell raised flags because they appeared to be hidden from your business partners and your wife. We need to understand whether these payments represent undisclosed business obligations that could affect your fiduciary duties to shareholders. Richard glanced at Thomas, who sat quietly beside him, fascinated by the official atmosphere of the FBI office. Linda had wanted to come, but Richard had asked her to stay in Millbrook. This conversation needed to happen between him and the world, with Thomas present not as evidence, but as the son he should have claimed decades ago. Agent Morse, Richard said, his voice steady for the first time in months. The payments to Linda Hartwell were child support. She's been raising my son since he was 14 months old. Child support payments that were never disclosed to your business partners or your wife? That's correct. Agent Morse made notes, her expression neutral. Mr. Donovan, can you help me understand why you would hide the existence of a child? particularly when your public persona has been built around family values and charitable work with children? It was the question that had haunted Richard for 30 years, asked now in a sterile government office with his son listening to every word. How do you explain shame to people who've never felt it? How do you justify cowardice to those who've never faced the choice between love and ambition? Because I was taught that having a child with Down syndrome was a business liability, Richard said quietly. Because my father convinced me that acknowledging Thomas would limit my opportunities and damage my reputation, because I was 26 years old and more afraid of appearing weak than of being alone. Thomas turned to look at his father, his expression serious. Dad, I'm not weak. No, son, you're the strongest person I know. It took me 30 years to figure that out. Agent Morse set down her pen. Mr. Donovan, from a federal perspective, there's no evidence of criminal wrongdoing here. These were personal payments made with your own funds. However, the SEC will need to determine whether your non-disclosure of significant personal expenses constitutes fraud against shareholders. Richard nodded. He'd expected as much. But the legal implications, while serious, paled beside the personal reckoning that was still to come. Agent Morse, there's something else you should know. I'm planning to hold a press conference this afternoon. I'm going to tell the complete truth about Thomas, about my choices, and about why I've spent 30 years lying to everyone who trusted me. Mr. Donovan, I'd strongly advise you to speak with your legal counsel before. I've been speaking with lawyers for 30 years. It's time to speak with my conscience. The drive from the FBI office to the Donovan Investments headquarters took Richard and Thomas through the heart of Chicago, past the landmarks of Richard's empire, the Willis Tower, where his first major deal had been signed, the Chicago Board of Trade, where he'd made his reputation, the Lincoln Park mansion where he'd lived with Margaret, surrounded by everything money could buy except the honesty that might have made it a home. Thomas pressed his face against the car window, watching the city with the wonder of someone seeing his father's world for the first time. It's so big, Thomas said. No wonder you had to work so much. Richard pulled the car over, suddenly unable to continue driving. They were parked outside Millennium Park, where families were enjoying the autumn afternoon, children playing while parents watched with the casual attention of people whose love didn't require secrecy. Thomas, Richard said, his voice breaking, I didn't have to work so much. I chose to work so much because it was easier than being your father in public. I let people think you didn't exist because I was scared they'd think less of me if they knew you existed. Thomas unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to face his father fully. Dad, do you think less of me? God, no, Thomas, you're... Then why do you care what other people think? The question was so simple, so direct, so completely free of the complex justifications Richard had built around his choices that it left him speechless. In 30 years of therapy sessions he'd never attended, board meetings he'd dreaded, and conversations with Margaret about their childless marriage, no one had ever asked him the fundamental question, if you love your son, why does anyone else's opinion matter? I don't know, Richard whispered. I honestly don't know anymore. Thomas reached over and took his father's hand. Dad, can I tell you something? Always. I used to think you were sad because you missed me when you went home. But Linda told me you were sad because you were ashamed of me. Richard's heart shattered. Thomas, it's okay. I know you love me, but I think maybe you should stop being ashamed of me, because I'm not ashamed of you. And there it was. The wisdom Richard had spent billions of dollars and decades of his life trying to acquire, spoken by his son with the simplicity that came from a heart untainted by the world's judgment. You're right, Richard said. God, Thomas, you're absolutely right. They sat together in the car, father and son, while Chicago moved around them. Richard thought about the press conference waiting for him, about Margaret's ultimatum, about the board meeting that would likely end his career. All of it seemed suddenly manageable because the most important person in his life was sitting beside him, offering forgiveness Richard had never asked for and love he'd never deserved. Thomas, Richard said, would you like to see where Daddy works, and maybe would you like to meet some reporters? Thomas's smile was radiant. Can I tell them about my job at the library? You can tell them anything you want. Okay, but Dad, yes? When we're done with the reporters, can we go get ice cream? I know a really good place in Millbrook. Richard laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in years. Son, after we're done with the reporters, we can do whatever you want. We have a lot of catching up to do. As they drove toward the Donovan Investments building, Richard realized he was about to lose everything he'd spent his adult life building. His marriage, his company, his reputation, his social standing, all of it would likely be gone by week's end. But for the first time in 30 years, Richard Donovan wasn't afraid, because he was finally going home. 6 months after the press conference that ended Richard Donovan's career and began his life, he sat in a small coffee shop in Millbrook, Wisconsin, reading the morning Chicago Tribune on his tablet. The headline read, "Donovan Investments posts record quarterly profits under new leadership." Margaret, as the new CEO, had successfully distanced the company from the Thomas scandal, as the business press had dubbed it. The stock price had recovered. The clients had stayed. The empire Richard built had survived his departure. He felt nothing but relief. "Dad, look!" Thomas burst through the coffee shop door, carrying a certificate in a protective plastic sleeve. "I got Employee of the Month at the library." Richard stood, embracing his son with the unself-conscious affection he'd denied himself for 30 years. The other customers in the coffee shop, most of whom had known Thomas since he was a toddler, smiled and applauded. In Millbrook, Thomas wasn't the disabled son of a disgraced billionaire. He was Thomas Donovan, the young man who helped children find books, who knew every regular patron's favorite genres, and who had never met a person he couldn't find something to like about. "That's incredible, son. Tell me everything." As Thomas launched into a detailed account of his library responsibilities, Richard marveled at the life his son had built without him. Thomas had friends, meaningful work, a community that valued him for exactly who he was. He had, in fact, everything Richard had spent decades chasing: respect, purpose, and relationships built on truth rather than performance. Linda joined them, sliding into the booth with the comfortable familiarity of family. At 58, she'd never married, never had children of her own, but had raised Thomas with more love and wisdom than Richard had ever managed to show anyone. "The documentary crew wants to film Thomas at work next week," she told Richard. "Are you okay with that?" Richard considered the question. Netflix was producing a feature-length documentary about their story, tentatively titled The Hidden Son, A Father's Reckoning. The producers wanted to explore themes of shame, disability rights, and the cost of the American dream. Richard had agreed to participate, but only on the condition that Thomas's dignity remained paramount in all decisions. "What does Thomas think?" "I want to do it," Thomas said firmly. "I want people to know that kids like me can do jobs and have friends and be happy. Kids like me." The phrase that had once filled Richard with dread now swelled his heart with pride. Thomas had claimed his identity with the courage Richard had never possessed, turning his differences into strengths rather than hiding them as weaknesses. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Rebecca Santos, the disability rights advocate who'd become his unlikely mentor over the past months. She was in Chicago, speaking at Northwestern University about inclusive corporate practices, and wanted Richard to join her for a panel discussion. "Your story has power," she'd told him during their first meeting. "Use it to change other minds before they make your mistakes." Richard had been reluctant at first. The media attention following his confession had been brutal. Late-night talk show monologues about Daddy Dearest, think pieces about the morality of success, and social media campaigns that ranged from "Justice for Thomas" to "Man, Richard Donovan is trash." But gradually a different narrative had emerged. Parents of children with disabilities began reaching out, sharing their own stories of fear and shame. Corporate executives asked for advice about inclusive policies. Young entrepreneurs wondered how to build companies that reflected their values rather than just their ambitions. "I think," Richard said slowly, "I'd like to do more speaking about business ethics, about what success actually means." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Richard Donovan, motivational speaker. Former Richard Donovan. I'm working on becoming someone new." It wasn't entirely true. Richard was still recognizably himself, still analytical, still ambitious, still possessed of the drive that had built an empire. But his ambitions had shifted. Instead of conquering markets, he wanted to change minds. Instead of accumulating wealth, he wanted to create worth. He'd started small. A blog about fatherhood and shame that had gone unexpectedly viral. Speaking engagements at business schools where he talked about the difference between success and significance. Consulting work with companies that wanted to improve their diversity and inclusion practices. The money was a fraction of what he'd earned at Donovan Investments, but it was enough. Linda had finally agreed to let him contribute equally to Thomas's care, and Richard had bought a modest house 3 blocks away, close enough for daily visits, far enough to respect the life Linda had built. Most surprisingly, Richard had discovered he was happier poor and honest than he'd ever been rich and deceptive. "Dad," Thomas said, interrupting Richard's thoughts, "can we go to Chicago next week? I want to see your old office." Richard's chest tightened. He hadn't been back to Chicago since the press conference, hadn't faced the city where he'd built his reputation and lost his way. Margaret had made it clear through lawyers that any contact should go through official channels. The Lincoln Park mansion was for sale. The life he'd constructed there belonged to someone else now, but Thomas wanted to see it. Thomas, who'd never been ashamed of his father, despite having every reason to be. "Are you sure? It might be complicated." Thomas grinned. "I'm good at complicated, remember?" Linda reached across the table and squeezed Richard's hand. "Maybe it's time. You can't spend forever hiding from your past, even when your past was hiding from you." That evening, as Richard walked Thomas home from the library, his son chatting about the new mystery novels that had arrived that day, Richard felt the familiar tug of gratitude that had become his constant companion. Gratitude for Linda's generosity, for Thomas's forgiveness, for the second chance he'd never deserved but had somehow received. They stopped at the park where Richard had pushed Thomas on swings during their secret visits, back when every moment together had been stolen from the life Richard thought he was supposed to want. "Dad," Thomas said suddenly, "are you sad that you lost all your money?" Richard considered the question seriously. "No, son, I'm sad that it took losing everything to find what I actually needed." "What did you need?" "You. Just you." Thomas hugged his father with the fierce affection of someone who'd waited 30 years to have his dad to himself. "I'm glad you found me. I'm glad you never gave up on me." As they finished their walk home, Richard thought about the Chicago trip, about facing Margaret and the board members and the reporters who'd want to know if he regretted his choices. He thought about the documentary cameras that would capture his story and broadcast it to millions of people he'd never meet. But mostly, he thought about Thomas's Employee of the Month certificate, proudly displayed on Linda's refrigerator next to 30 years of school photos and achievement awards from a son who'd excelled in every way that mattered, while his father had been learning the difference between success and worth. In 3 decades of business victories, Richard had never felt prouder of anything than he felt of Thomas's library certificate. And in all his years of empire building, he'd never built anything as valuable as the relationship with his son that he was finally brave enough to claim. The hidden son was hidden no longer, and Richard Donovan, for the first time in his adult life, was exactly who he was supposed to be, Thomas's father, without shame, without secrets, and without apology. In a world obsessed with success, he had finally learned that the greatest achievement was simply to love without fear. And love, he had discovered, was the only empire that could never be destroyed by truth. As they reached Linda's front porch, Thomas turned back toward the park, his face serious in the way it got when he was processing something important. "Dad, next time you visit me, you don't have to leave, right?" Richard knelt down so he was eye level with his son, this remarkable young man who'd inherited his father's determination, but none of his cowardice. "Son," Richard said, his voice steady with 30 years of overdue certainty, "I'm never leaving again." And for the first time since Thomas was born, Richard Donovan meant exactly what he said. In a world obsessed with success, Richard Donovan spent 30 years building a financial empire while hiding the son he loved most. When Thomas appeared at his father's funeral, he revealed not just a secret, but the truth about what makes a life worth living. That love without shame is the only victory that matters, and that our greatest achievements are often found in the people we're brave enough to claim as our own.